Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another English Wednesdays with Macmillan Education and Mondadori Education. My name is Casimir, and I'm the Regional Manager for Italy with Macmillan Education. I'd like to introduce my friend and colleague, Ethan Mansur, who will be discussing the four skills and the first, who I know many of you are preparing your students for. So without further ado, I'll pass the mic on to Ethan. And there is a place where you can put your questions. I'll be monitoring those. And in the final few moments, I'll come back in and we can have a bit of a conversation and try to address those questions. So without further ado, this time for real, Ethan, it's all you. Thank you.
Thanks, Casimir. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. So as Casimir said, we'll be focusing on the four skills today, sort of within the context of exam preparation. So let's get started. So I want to start with a quote from the main author of this book, Roy Norris. And he said this in a webinar that he gave last year about the new 4th edition of his exam preparation book. And he said that exam preparation should be about teaching, not about testing. And as somebody who's spent a lot of time myself preparing students for the Cambridge exams, I really couldn't agree more with this statement because in my experience, an exam preparation course is a great place to help students develop their language skills. And I think we should think of the test at the end of the courses, students often do at the end of our courses, as being sort of a prize, for having reached, the level that they needed to reach. Because I think exam preparation sometimes has this association with just doing lots of exams, sort of doing lots of past papers. And, that type of practice does have its place in this type of course. But the reality is that students actually need to have a B2 level of English to pass a B2 exam. And an exam preparation course is an excellent place to help them reach that level that they need to reach. So with that in mind, we're going to be talking about how this new 4th edition of Ready for B2 First by Roy Norris helps students develop those 4 skills that they need to pass that exam. And along the way, I'll be giving you some exam prep tips. So I'm an exam preparation teacher, and I'm always looking for a good exam tip, and I like to share the ones that I find. In fact, some of the tips that I'm going to share, they're in the teacher's book that I wrote for this particular course. So let's get started. And I thought that maybe just to get us sort of started talking about the 4 skills, maybe we could just have a quick activity in the chat box. So I want you to tell me, in your experience, which of the 4 skills are your students good at? So just choose one, if you can, that you think your students are, they're generally they're pretty good at. And just put that in the chat box for me, please. Okay, so we've got lots of reading. That's great. I see use of English as well. Lots of reading. That's great. So it looks like reading is something that Italian students, at least, are doing very well with. I'm sure they have good teachers that are helping them be good at those skills. So there are other skills as well. So people mentioned writing and speaking, but it did seem like reading was the dominant one, at least in the chat box here. So I'm going to ask you another question, which is, which of the 4 skills do you think your students generally find most challenging? So again, choose one if you can, that you think your students maybe find a bit more challenging than the other ones. I'm seeing listening. Lots of listening. Lots of listening, some writing, and speaking as well. Yeah. So it seems like a lot of people are saying listening. Obviously, we're going to talk about the 4 skills today, but maybe we'll try to spend a little bit more time on listening if we can. And if you have any particular questions about helping students with their listening skills, as they come up, I can answer them in the chat box, or we can save those questions for the question and answer at the end. Let's move on. So first, we'll start with reading. So it sounds like your students are generally quite good at reading, which is great. It's an important part of learning a language, and it's an important part of this B2 first exam as well. So I wanted to start this section with another quotation, and this one's from Françoise Grillet. And she wrote a very interesting book called Developing Reading Skills. It's one of the books that I read in preparation for this webinar. And one thing that she said that I really liked was that reading is a process of constant guessing. And so she's talking about reading in the context of a second language, of course. And that struck me as being really true. When you're sort of faced with a text in a language that you haven't completely mastered, you start by sort of making some guesses about, well, so what is this about? You look at the title, maybe the picture, and then while you're reading it, you're sort of thinking about what's coming next, what information or how is the story going to end? You're sort of guessing while you're reading. And also, let's face it, when you're reading something in another language, there's often a time when you don't quite understand something. You don't understand a specific word, or an entire clause. And so you're sort of having to guess what the meaning of that unknown language is. And you're sort of using contextual clues, etc., to do that. So with this sort of idea of reading being this process of guessing, Grillet sort of lays out what she calls a global approach to reading in a second language. Sort of a principled approach to helping students understand texts. And it sort of goes from like a global kind of big picture understanding to a more detailed understanding of sort of individual elements of meaning in the text. So she talks about the importance of starting with a bit of prediction, looking at the title, looking at the picture, as well as the importance of anticipation. And this is where the teacher comes in. We want to create anticipation for the things that we're going to have our students read, because we want our students to want to read what they're going to read, because they'll read it better if they're actually interested in it. And then sort of once you've sort of done some prediction, then you kind of check that prediction by doing a quick kind of skimming type of reading, which is then sort of confirmed maybe in open class. And then you'd move sort of into more prediction, sort of more detailed prediction about specific sort of meaning in the text. And then you sort of read the text more carefully once more. You've gone deeper and you've understood sort of more specific meaning and information in the text. And then this type of reading lesson would finish with a stage that I think is sometimes left out, which is sort of a discussion or a personalization task, which is actually part of the comprehension of the text, because at this point students are sort of using what they've read and sort of processing it through their own sort of opinions and evaluating it, and that actually helps them understand the text better. So it is actually part of the comprehension process. So you'll find that when you open a page in this new 4th edition of Ready for B2 First, you'll see this kind of global approach in action. You'll see that the tasks, the reading tasks like this one, they start with some type of prediction task where, in this case, we're asking students to look at pictures. And actually, one thing Kashmir and I were just talking about is that we both really like the images in this new version. It's got this updated sort of nice visual appeal to it. And this reading is taking advantage of those images in the prediction task. And then, of course, you have the skimming task, where students sort of look through the text quickly to get a general idea. So I just want to sort of stop for a minute and put on my kind of exam preparation hat and sort of stop talking about sort of teaching reading in general. So skimming, like reading the text quickly, it's an effective exam strategy, because if students have that general idea of what the text is about, they can go and answer the questions more quickly and more efficiently. However, I'm speaking from personal experience here. I think sometimes we give students too much time to do that skimming activity in class, and it's not actually a skimming activity. So the idea of a skimming activity is students read it really fast, like 2 or 3 minutes or something. And if you sort of give students kind of as much time as they want to do that first reading, they're not going to read it that fast, generally speaking. So I think that maybe setting a time limit can actually be a useful kind of exam training strategy, because in reality, on exam day, students really aren't going to have enough time to read the whole text sort of carefully and then look at the questions and then sort of read the text again very carefully. There's just not time for that. So they need to get into the habit of doing that first kind of global reading, the skimming, a little bit quicker than maybe they would ideally like to. So, so after you've done that skimming, you go over and then you sort of work with the detailed sort of questions in the task, multiple choice in this case. And that's, of course, followed at the end with another one of these sort of speaking activities where students can where students can discuss their personal sort of opinions about about the information in the text. This particular one, it's one of my favorite readings from the new book. It's about a girl who did an around the world trip, which is something I've always wanted to do and still haven't had a chance. It's actually a true story. Roy interviewed a woman who did this and sort of wrote the article about it. So as I said, I can't sort of resist including exam preparation tips. I just love a good exam tip. So this one is this one's for multiple choice questions in particular. So one thing I see with my students, sort of without any kind of exam training, what they would naturally do is they would read the question, which is, how did Rosie react after she received her exam results? And then basically they would go to the text and they would look for A, they would look for B, they would look for C, they would look for D. So, that's logical. However, I don't think it's the most effective way of getting to the right answer. And I think when students do that, they're in more danger of getting tricked by distractors. So what I suggest to my students is that they actually ignore the answers and just focus on the question. So the question was, how did Rosie react after she received her exam results? And then you'd go to the text and try to answer that question. So it's sort of this idea of reading being a bit of a guessing game. So you sort of, well, how did she react? So you go and you find that in the text and you find this line that says, she began to feel proud of her accomplishments and vowed to turn disappointment into opportunity. You say, okay, so that's how she reacted. I think I understand that. And then you go back to the options and you choose the one that's closest to what you've read in the text. And you can see where it's a little bit faster because you're looking for just one thing instead of 4 things. And you're sort of not as much in danger of getting tricked by distractors because you've already identified sort of the correct information in the text, and now you just need to match it to sort of the paraphrased version of it, sort of the closest version of it in the multiple choice activity. Okay, so that's my exam tip for reading. If you haven't tried this one already, maybe you could try that out with your students and see how it goes. There's, of course, never just one way of doing an exam task or any kind of reading task. Students need to find the strategy that works best for them. But this strategy, I think it does end up being at least more effective than the first strategy I described, where you're looking for all the options. So with that, we're going to move on to listening. So I've put listening and reading sort of together because I think they have a lot in common. They're both receptive skills. We're sort of receiving information. We are sort of trying to process and understand something rather than, for example, producing language the way we do with speaking or writing. So they have that in common. And interestingly, at least on the Cambridge exams, the questions that you have to answer are actually pretty similar too. So you have multiple choice reading tasks, and you also have multiple choice listening tasks. In fact, you have 2. So, listening and reading, they definitely have something in common. However, they're also very different. They're also quite different. when we're listening to something, we don't have the option usually of just stopping, when we didn't quite understand something. When we're reading, we can kind of stop and say, I wonder what that means. Or even when we're reading, we can kind of space out, and then you come back, I wasn't really reading that last sentence that I read. I'll read it again. You don't really have that option with listening. And that can be a little bit stressful for students. And you all mentioned in the chat box, not all of you, but many of you mentioned that listening is something your students find challenging. And I think that might be one source of that difficulty. In fact, this is one way my students have described listening to me when it is really difficult. It sort of feels like this flow of information. It's sort of, it's you're getting lost. You're sort of getting stressed out. You can't stop it. And so when we talk about sort of helping students develop the listening skill, we're sort of helping them develop strategies to help them sort of manage this sort of flow of information. As I mentioned, usually with listening, you can't just stop and and go back. At least you can't do that on the exam, right? The supervisor pushes play and you listen. And if you didn't understand something, well, too bad. You do listen twice, but However, that's not true in class, right? If students are really struggling, if you sort of see fear in their face when they're doing the listening, you can just push pause, And I think the pause button is sort of an underused resource with listening. I think, and again, speaking from personal experience, I think sometimes teachers were a little bit lazy sometimes with listening. We just kind of push play and we kind of sit there and then we just wait for it to finish. And then we kind of deal with the answers and we correct the exercise, etc. But for me, there's particularly at the beginning of an exam preparation course or any course really, if students are finding a skill like listening difficult, we can make it easier. We can scaffold it more, we can support them. And one way is just stopping the listening sometimes and breaking it up into sections. So for example, in this type of listening activity, basically what happens is it's an interview. And so you have a question from the interviewer, and then you have an answer from the person being interviewed. So it's just question, answer, question, answer. And each of those sort of question, answer sections is actually corresponds to one of the multiple choice questions. So students can actually kind of think of this type of listening as sort of mini little listenings, And they know that when they hear a new question, that probably means that they have to move on to the next question on their page. And sort of helping students develop an awareness of this, it makes that kind of flood of information a little bit more manageable. So even if they did completely miss the answer to one question, they hear the interviewer asking another question, they're like, okay, I need to move on. I need to look at the next question. And hopefully I can get that one right. Instead of just sort of getting completely lost and not sort of answering any of the questions potentially, which can happen if the listening is much too difficult. So that's my exam tip, is at least at the beginning of the course, don't be afraid to hit the pause button. It's a good resource. Another great resource, which I think you'll find is used to very good effect in Ready for B2 First, is the audio script. And this is just one example. What the author has done here is they've had the students look at the first question, and then before they've even listened to anything, they go and they look at the audio script and they look at what the person's going to say, and they kind of do a little bit of a guided discovery activity where they're encouraged to look at how the language from the question is paraphrased in the text, how the word but often introduces distractors. And so, helping students develop an awareness of the task type is particularly important in exam preparation, because we all know that, Cambridge is not going to put an episode of Game of Thrones on the exam. Our students may be watching lots of English TV, but that's not necessarily going to mean that they're going to do really well on a listening test. They're going to have to sort of develop a good awareness of the task itself and the type of sort of tricky questions that that they're going to have to answer along the way. So this is just one simple way of using the audio script, getting students to basically identify distractors and getting them to identify the answer. So I was just thinking, I'm sure I'm not the only one, and I'm sure Roy North's not the only one who uses the audio script sometimes in listening lessons. So I was thinking I would ask you, maybe we could do a little brainstorming. So what are some other effective ways of using the audio script to support or train students in a listening lesson? So I'll just give you a moment to answer that question in the chat box. Anybody got any bright ideas? Somebody said using BBC podcasts. Yeah. I'm not sure you can use the audio script with a BBC podcast. Maybe they do come with audio scripts. I'm not sure. Yeah, maybe selecting certain parts. Rafaela said this. That makes sense. Yeah, sort of isolating maybe. So for example, if everybody in the class got exercise 6 wrong, maybe taking a time to go send everybody to the audio script and look at the answer for exercise 6. Sort of, why was 6 hard? Let's try to figure out. Maybe it was a vocabulary item, that kind of thing. And somebody saying to use the audio script to do I sort of missed it. Sometimes the chat moves too fast. Getting students to focus on the spelling and the pronunciations. Yeah, so maybe sometimes students don't understand something because they are maybe familiar with the word, but they don't actually know what it sounds like. You know, maybe they've seen it written, but they don't quite understand it when someone says it. So things like that. So I think just to give a couple more ideas. So I think one nice thing to do is you can have the students do the listening as a listening, but instead of just checking the answers, you can send them to the audio script with a partner and have them just quickly check their answers by looking through the audio script. And I think that helps them. It's a nice sort of differentiation technique. So if somebody did have a really hard time with the listening, they do come up with the answers before they're checked in open class. And it also helps students sort of develop an understanding of why certain questions were more difficult than others. Maybe there was this very particularly good distractor or something like that. Okay, so let's move on to speaking. So one word I think that you'll find a lot in the new edition, as well as in the old edition actually, but particularly in the the 4th edition of Ready for B2 First is this word, speak. And on the page, speak sort of indicates that students are sort of have the opportunity to do some kind of communicative activity. Usually it involves sort of pair or group work. So this exam preparation book, obviously it's preparing students for the exam, but it's also sort of embracing this communicative approach to language learning where we understand that students need a lot of fluency practice. They just need a lot of time to speak in the language in order to be good at speaking it. And this type of sort of fluency type of activity, it also gives the teacher the opportunity to do a little bit of close listening, maybe taking some notes about common mistakes, and it can actually be a way of students helping our students develop accuracy as well. And as I said, you can sort of find it everywhere. You can find it at the beginning and at the ending of reading texts, as we found when we were talking about this particular reading task. You can find it in the vocabulary sections as well. So, for example, you might get students to do some brainstorming together, so you kind of get an idea of how much of this vocabulary they're familiar with already before we sort of introduce some new language. And then there's speak activities afterwards where students are activating this new language that they've learned. They're getting some productive practice with it. Because as we know, it's important for students not just to sort of be able to recognize new vocabulary, but they need to be able to use it. they need to be able to use in their speaking and their writing, the kind of things that are tested on this exam. It's also true of the grammar sections. There are communicative activities in the grammar section. And in particular, I think you'll find that more space has actually been created for this type of communicative type of activity in the grammar sections. A little bit of the sort of controlled practice has now been moved to the back of the book, sort of closer to the grammar rules. And I think, it's part of the reason for that is to encourage sort of teachers not to just sort of spend the whole class doing lots of gap fills, and those of course are important, but we want to use class time to getting students to really use the language and produce it with sort of meaningful communicative activities. And of course you can also find it even in the writing sections. You kind of think of writing as not being very related to speaking, but there's a lot of sort of nice speaking activities that can be integrated into a writing lesson, as we all know, and that's been incorporated into this book as well. So in addition to all of those kind of little speak activities throughout the book, there's also sections dedicated specifically, as of course you would imagine, to the speaking paper of the Cambridge B2 first exam. And these are exam tasks effectively that students can do in class and get practice sort of with the type of speaking that specifically they're going to have to do on the exam. And you'll find that there's some very nice advice. They have these, they're called what to expect on the exam boxes and how to go about it boxes, and useful language. There's a lot of support there to give students little tips and maybe little bits of functional language. They're going to help them do this type of task a little bit easier, a little bit more fluently. So just to finish with my exam tip for speaking. So when you look at the way that the B2 first is assessed, so when I'm talking about the speaking exam in particular, when a candidate goes and does the speaking exam, a speaking examiner, like me, I'm a speaking examiner, I listen for 4 things. I listen for grammar and vocabulary, discourse management, which is essentially fluency and sort of your ability to coherently kind of express your thoughts, pronunciation, and interactive communication, which is basically how well students interact with each other. But I think it's worth noting that actually pronunciation is worth exactly as much as grammar and vocabulary. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say that probably most teachers, when they think about teaching speaking, they probably tend to focus a little bit more on the accuracy of grammar and vocabulary. And I know I'm guilty of this myself. I like to sort of pick up on little things that I can help students improve. But actually, we need to be focusing on pronunciation in exam preparation courses because it's an important part of students' mark. And I think a little bit can go a long way, actually. Some teachers, they sort of avoid pronunciation because they feel like it's sort of difficult and complicated. And there are certainly aspects of pronunciation that are difficult and complicated. However, there's sort of little things that we can do. We can, when students are doing a speaking activity, we can just write down a couple of the words that a number of students were saying a little bit unclearly or a little bit incorrectly. We can just put those up on the board and make students aware of the correct pronunciation, or maybe give them a little bit of practice repeating after you or something. Something just that simple, just raising students' awareness of the words that they're not saying very clearly, and that will probably, not say very clearly on the exam day as well. But if you want to kind of do a little bit more focused practice for the exam, you can go to the new pronunciation sections in this book, which have been specifically designed to work on pronunciation, aspects of pronunciation that are tested or relevant to the Cambridge exam itself. This is a good example. So this is one with intonation. Somebody actually mentioned, Giuseppe mentioned intonation being very important. And in fact, that is important on the exam. It's literally in the description, students have to use intonation sort of successfully or correctly. And so this, I think, so again, sometimes you might think, well, teaching intonation, well, that sounds hard. But these are very sort of teacher-friendly pronunciation activities. I think you'll find they don't take any kind of specialized knowledge of pronunciation. So I'll just give you an example. So this one is using intonation to express interest, which is something you could use in a speaking exam. And what it talks about is two intonation patterns. One is rise, fall, and the other one is fall. So we're going to do this in the chat box. I'm going to read the word really with the intonation pattern for A, and I'm going to read it twice. And then I'm going to read the intonation pattern for B twice. And then in the chat box, just tell me which one sounds like I'm showing interest. So here's the first one. Really? Really? Okay, so that was A. So here comes B. Really? Really? So just in the chat box, so which one am I showing interest in what the other person's saying? Is it A or B? Yeah, everybody's saying A. Yeah. So yeah, I think that students they immediately kind of recognize this. It's like you're teaching them something they sort of already know, but maybe aren't doing as successfully as they could. And just sort of this, I mean, it doesn't take a long time to do this kind of thing. We can make room for in our classes. This simple exercise took about 1 or 2 minutes. And raising students' awareness of this type of thing, it's going to lead, hopefully, to them using intonation a bit more successfully on the exam and getting those sort of extra points for pronunciation that they might be missing out otherwise. So that brings us to writing, and I sort of saved writing for last because it's my favorite. I'm a teacher who likes teaching writing. And I find that I really like teaching writing in an exam preparation course context because I really like how much progress students can make in a very short time. You can help students develop listening and reading and speaking, of course, over time. But with writing, you can get a lot done very quickly. If you can get students to start sort of using topic sentences and organizing their ideas into paragraphs and paying more attention to what it says in the instructions, so they're not missing out on sort of easy content points, you can dramatically improve students' writing, and that's one reason why I think it's something that I like teaching. So how do we teach writing in a second language? So there are two kind of main approaches to it, sort of dominant approaches. There's one called the genre approach, and then there's another competing one called the process approach. So I'm just going to talk about both of those, and then we can talk about sort of how they're relevant to helping students improve their writing in an exam preparation course. So here's the genre approach. So basically, this one is based on model text. So for example, if we're going to be writing a film review, this is something you have to do on this exam if you want to. It's one of the choices in part 2. You would take a film review, and then you'd have students basically analyze it. You would have them look and think about, well, so what's the purpose? Who's actually going to be listening, sort of reading this? And then you kind of zero in on well, how is it organized? Did they put the recommendation first, or did they put it last? Did they talk about the plot first, or did they analyze sort of talking about sort of the order of the information and looking at some of the typical language that comes up. So film reviews often include recommendations at the end. So what language is being used to give those recommendations? And then sort of after this analysis, after they sort of get a good idea of what they're doing, they would write their own film review. So good way of teaching writing, but it's not the only way. There's another one called the process approach. And my slide got moved a little bit. I don't like that G down there. So this one it's different because we're not looking at a film review. So if we wanted to write a film review, we would start by brainstorming, well, if I'm going to read a film, what information do I want to have. What do I want to learn? Well, I want to know the title of the film. First of all, that would be important. I want to know what it's about. I want to know if it's good or it's bad. So you sort of do some brainstorming, and then you would think about yeah, and then you think about sort of planning. So you say, well, where do you think I should put the recommendation? Well, maybe I should put it last. Yeah, that seems like a good place for it. And sort of talk about this, and then you would go ahead and write a first version of it. Students would either write this in class or at home, but then they would come back in and they would sort of discuss it, compare and contrast. The teacher would give them some feedback, and then they would go ahead and write it again. And so hopefully by the final version, they've come up with a pretty decent film review. So these are both good ways of teaching writing. I think they have strengths and weaknesses, certainly, but both of them work. And I think I wanted to talk about this because actually what the main author Roy Norris has done in Ready for B2 First is very interesting because he's sort of integrated them both. I think he's taken sort of strengths from both of those approaches and sort of put them together. So for example, this is a lesson about writing an informal letter. And we do have a model, right? We have a model for the students to look at. We have some analysis of the language and the structure. So we have some genre sort of analysis going on. However, we also have students brainstorming, thinking about what they would like to put in their letter, what would be important to put in the letter. And they have some very detailed and useful advice about how to go about planning our writing too, because I think we all know that when our students spend a bit more time planning, they're more likely to produce something that's more coherent and better organized. So you can see we're taking sort of elements of both of those approaches. And I think you'll find that this is one of my favorite parts of this course book. I've taught the third edition for many years, and I think the writing sections are particularly good. I think that when students do go through these types of lessons, they get a good awareness of what they need to do, and definitely they're definitely producing much better writing as a result of it. So to finish with an exam tip for writing, my exam tip is checklists. If you do end up using this course book and you use my teacher's book, you'll see that I kind of make this suggestion again and again in the writing sections. I'm a big fan of a checklist. Yeah, I think checklists are just useful in everyday life, right? I mean, they're useful at a hospital, so nurses don't forget to give patients medicine. They're useful in lots of other contexts. It's just a good way of not forgetting important stuff. And so I think if you think about what makes a good informal letter, and particularly if you look at sort of the assessment criteria that Cambridge uses to assess the writing, which is included in the teacher's book, by the way. There's sort of example answers and then example sort of marking of those answers, so you can get a good idea of sort of what Cambridge is looking for. And if you turn that into just simple questions that students can ask themselves while they're writing, and particularly when they're finished, did I actually organize my ideas into logical paragraphs? Did I use an informal style? Was I thinking about that enough? And sort of if students do this checklist and then they sort of hand their writing into you, a lot of the work has already been done, because this is exactly what I'm looking for and what I'm going to be sort of correcting or giving feedback on. And if students have already thought about what I'm going to think about, then they're sort of one step ahead of me, and they've probably corrected things that I was going to have to correct, if you know what I mean. This way, they're also they're internalizing the assessment criteria for the task itself, meaning that when they write their exam writing on that exam day, they'll have in mind what the writing examiner will in fact be looking for when they mark their writing. So yeah, just an easy, simple tool that can be relatively easily implemented, I think, at least in my own experience. So we're sort of coming to the end of the talk here. So we've talked about the different 4 skills. We've looked at some exam tips along the way. So I just wanted to finish with this activity. If you've seen any of my other webinars, you'll know I like to finish with this activity because it's an activity that I like to finish with in class as well. It's sort of a nice formative assessment type activity. So I'd like to know what ideas or activities or exam tips do you think are going to stick with you from this talk? Which ones do you think will be useful in your teaching context? Which ones would you like to try out? So I'm going to just give you a moment to write in the chat box. So Suzanne says using checklists. Patricia says the importance of pronunciation and intonation. I'll just give you a moment to see if anybody else has something they like to. All right, so yeah, I see some people mentioning pronunciation, a few more checklists as well. Yeah, maybe not rushing listening, maybe being willing to stop it sometimes. Okay, so, well, I'm glad that you got something useful out of today's session. As I said, it's a nice way of finishing a lesson as well with your students, because it kind of leaves them feeling I learned something today because they sort of thought about what they learned. And also it's nice for the teacher as well, because you kind of go out of the classroom thinking, well, I actually taught something today. I did something useful with my time. So with that, we can move on to the question and answers. I think, Kazimir, you've been keeping an eye on the chat probably closer than me. I tend to not always pay as much attention to the chat as I probably should.
Yeah, sure. So we still have got about 10, 15 minutes. So everyone can keep adding questions. In the meantime, we do have a few that I wanted to run by you. So one of them, and good luck with answering this one, but it says, one of the most difficult things I find is getting students to really listen to each other and react in a logical way, as speaking specifically about the part 3 in the FCE.
Yes.
So, any tips on getting teenagers, I think, to listen and react logically?
Yeah, I find this to be true. I think it's interesting that people that may actually be good listeners, sort of in their first language, they're not always good listeners in a second language. I think that sometimes, when someone else is talking, it's like we get a break and we can think about what we're going to say, because that's helpful. Obviously, when you have to say something in another language. Yeah, I think it's a good point to make, because we looked at that assessment criteria, and one of the assessment criteria was interactive communication. And again, that's actually as important as grammar and vocabulary. So it's something to focus on if we want our students to do well on the exam. And also, I mean, it's just a good life skill. Like,
yeah, it's for the exam, everything is equally important, right? So
exactly. So yeah, I think I think focusing on it is a good start. So making it kind of the assessment criteria to focus on in a speaking activity. So give students an exam task like the ones in the book, but say, I'm going to be listening for one thing. I'm going to be listening for interaction. I'm going to be listening for how well you actually listen to what the other person says and react to it or add to it. And I'm also going to be listening for people who are not listening and are just talking about their own opinions and not listening to the other people. I'm going to be listening for that too. And so when you're going around sort of taking notes, taking notes of, yes, so Andrea, she did a great job of listening to Giuseppe in this case. Yeah. Susanna, well, she wasn't doing a great, she was talking an awful lot, and she wasn't really letting her partner talk at all. And sort of sharing your observations with the class, because I think that students aren't always really aware of that they're not good at something until you tell them. It's sort of like if you're not aware of a grammar mistake until someone corrects it. I mean, how many times have our students said, you correct something in class and they say, I've been saying that wrong for years, and nobody ever told me. Well, I mean, the same thing is kind of true with interaction. If you don't focus on it, if you don't sort of make students aware of it, then they're not going to get better at it. One more activity I do with my students is I give them an exam task to do, but I put them in a group of 3. 2 students do the task, and the other student just listens. And they listen and write down and try to make observations about sort of positive examples of interaction. And that's their only thing that they're listening for there. And then they kind of share their feedback with the students who have done the exam task. And then, of course, they could sort of switch roles, and then a new student could be listening. They could be doing a new speaking task together. And just raising awareness of it, I think, is a great place to start.
Yeah, Maria Teresa made a comment about something you're saying now related to that question. It's just something I think is very true. And it comes out especially in the writing, lack of coherence and logic. Students are not used to planning, right? I think so. If you want them to be thinking logically and coherently, then you can't expect them to just do that. You've got to teach them to plan and how to plan and so on. So
yeah, you can just make them plan things. If you sort of make students do it, they have to do it, and they will do it. And you could always do an activity where you sort of had them do a writing that they didn't plan at all, and make sure they don't plan it. And then you could have them do a similar writing and actually have them plan it first, and then they could look at the different pieces of writing. It's planning makes a difference when it comes to coherence and logic too. As somebody mentioned, I think Maria Teresa mentioned logic. It's not just teenagers that write things that don't make sense. I have adult students who do that too. And it's not that they didn't think enough about it. It's just I think that when you're trying to think of what you're going to write while you're writing, you're sort of doing 2 things at the same time. Whereas if you spend time planning, as you said, and you sort of have your ideas and you know more or less how you're going to approach them, before you start writing, you can focus on the writing. You can focus on clearly expressing the ideas that you sort of come up with already.
Yeah. Okay. There's a couple more. I'm just trying to see which one to choose first. So here's one. Changing topics, really. So the question is effectively, what is accepted as standard English? I've got an opinion on that, but I'll let you answer that. They're saying that there's British and American English or other regional or national accents. What's standard English? I will say that there are more fluent. I think people are getting away now from the expression mother tongue, but there's more fluent English speakers in India than there are in the UK, for example. Right. Yes. And a lot more. So anyway, I don't know if you've got a thought on that, or.
So I assume we're probably talking about this in the context of the Cambridge exams, sort of.
Well, I think it's like in the Cambridge exam, it's UK kind of standard British English, but I think it's a wider question about like, is there a standard English?
So I'll start with the Cambridge exams, just in case there was any confusion about that. So you on the B2 first on the listening exam, you're very likely to hear an American accent, and one sounds like mine, or a Scottish accent or an Irish accent. It's not just sort of standard sort of UK pronunciation, for one thing. And if you look at the sort of the handbook for teachers, which sort of lays out the exam specifications, you'll find in the speaking section it specifically says that they don't expect students to use any particular variety of English. So they could be using Singapore English, they could be using Indian English, they could be using Canadian English. It doesn't matter, as long as they're intelligible. If you look at sort of the pronunciation scales, it doesn't say sounds like a native speaker or sounds like someone who's British. What it says is intelligible. You're either intelligible or you're not. You're either clear or you're not. And that's kind of the bar for pronunciation. And in fact, for B2 first, I think it says you have to be generally intelligible. So even if you're pronouncing things with an accent and it's making it a little bit hard for the person to understand you, you can still do very well on the pronunciation section, as long as you're doing other things well. You're using intonation well. You're generally speaking, so pronouncing words correctly instead of, I don't know, saying Eastland instead of island, that kind of thing. As long as you're doing enough things right, you can have a very strong accent actually, and do very well in these exams. So going from there, I think you're absolutely right that this idea of there being standards is it's not going away, but I think people are starting to realize that lots of people speak English, and lots of people have spoken English for a long time. So it doesn't really make sense to only think of UK English or American English as being sort of the standard to try to reach.
Particularly when it comes to accents. Right.
And like, I mean, we know we're both from the United States. People from different parts of the United States sound very different, and they're perfectly intelligible. They just have a different sounding accent. And as long as you're clearly intelligible, it doesn't really matter what accent you have, as long as you can communicate effectively in English.
Yeah. However, bringing this back to the exam, so there's the real world and then there's the exam. Giuseppe Palma has got a question here, which I think probably a lot of people are now thinking about as you say that. What if exactly, you can see that there, if students use like a North American spelling, or they use a more American expression or something, would that be counted as a mistake in the writing paper?
No.
Okay.
They say that they accept any sort of standard, any English that's going to be sort of easy to understand. The only thing they say about using American words and spelling as well, because obviously there's spelling differences, is the only thing they don't like is when you use one spelling here and then you use a different spelling down here, or if you use one word up here like cell phone and then you use mobile phone down here. They sort of ask you to be consistent, but actually I really don't think this is something for teachers to be worried about, because if you read sort of the explanation of it, it's like a footnote, in the writing section. It's literally the last thing that teachers should be worried about. And the people that, I don't know how much you know about the Cambridge exams, but the people who mark the writing, they read them incredibly fast, like 5 minutes or something, and they mark students. I mean, do you think that they're really going to spend a lot of time being like, I think that person spelled it with a Z up here and an S down? That's just not what they're looking for.
The way it works.
And it doesn't really matter, like if you press, as long as you can read it and understand it, it's really not an issue. And I know that sort of in the past, there was sort of this concern about sort of mixing British and American English together. But like, it doesn't matter. I mean, as long as you understand what the person's saying, I mean, as long as they're not using a word you're completely unfamiliar with, it's really hard for me to see why that would be any kind of a problem in terms of using English successfully. And one thing I wanted to mention was somebody said that they're a Cambridge examiner like me.
Yeah,
and
Julie Newman. That's a really good point.
In fact, a lot of Cambridge examiners are not actually from America or UK or Ireland. At my school, we have examiners who are Spanish, and we have examiners who are Italian. We have examiners who are Dutch. You don't have to be British or American to be a Cambridge examiner. So, like literally on the day of the test, you may not be speaking to a British or American person. You may be speaking to an Italian who just happens to speak English incredibly well.
Right, exactly. And Julie made a follow-up comment. There is no, and this is something you were saying, Ethan, it's not an issue if they've got an American accent during the exam.
Nope.
And I think that's probably true if they've got a North American accent, British accent, or they're speaking with an accent from the subcontinent or wherever else. As long as, like you said, as long as they're speaking correctly and intelligibly, that's fine.
Yeah, I think Julie, I think it's Julie who said she was at Cambridge. I'm sure she would agree with me. You know, sometimes you get students who come in with this beautiful Irish accent. You're like, oh, that's amazing. You know, they must have spent time in Ireland, or they maybe they watched a lot of American television or whatever. But yeah, it's intelligibility. It's how clearly and easy it is for you to understand the person. That's the most important thing.
One final point on this, because I've seen Maria Teresa has posted a couple questions on this issue, and she's saying, I think it's a no, but I'll just ask it anyway. If a student is moving from an American accent to an English accent, I don't think that's actually going to be a real problem for your student test takers. You know, I don't think it wouldn't be a problem, but I almost don't think there might be the rare exception of a student who's moving from one accent to another. But
it happens. It happens. You know, sometimes I find that students have clearly had sort of a British teacher and they're pronouncing some words with a very British accent, but then other words they probably learned somewhere else. They probably learned in a TV series or something. So they're
or something. Yeah, exactly.
And sometimes it's like a curiosity. It's like, oh wow, that's kind of interesting why they're doing that. But to me as an examiner, never in any moment am I saying like, oh, I'm gonna have to mark them down for that. You know, at no time. It's basically, we have to think about like, is the person communicating successfly? Do I understand what they're saying? Is it creating difficulty for me? If it's not, then they're intelligible.
Yeah. Let's, Ethan, if you don't mind, we've only got about 4 minutes, so let's move off this topic, interesting though it is, because there are quite a few other questions, and I'd like to get, maybe not to all of them, but try to address a few more. Let's see here. This is one that could probably take a very long time to answer, but it's about how do you get students thinking in English? I think that's almost the whole point of everything, right? But you know, how do you get them thinking in English? Do you have any tips in 2 minutes about that?
So I think that teachers sometimes are concerned about students sort of relying on their first language when they're speaking a second language. But I think that is just a reality. That's just how your brain works. It's not something that students can turn on and off. I know I'm a fluent Italian and Spanish speaker, and I know that, for example, now my Italian is not as good because I've lived in Spain for many years. And so now when I have to speak Italian, I'm relying a bit more on English or even sometimes Spanish, actually, to figure out what to say. But if I'm in a conversation for longer, if I start speaking Italian for a longer time, I start sort of, things come to me quicker. I'm starting to sort of, things are coming to me first in Italian. I'm not having to work as hard. So I think that giving students room to talk, developing fluency, the more that students are talking in English, you know, the more that they're going to be moving away from needing the support of their first language and moving more towards sort of using, just not needing to to go looking for comparisons or something. But at a B2 level, that's still normal. And I don't think it's always a bad thing. I think that this is funny because I think that teachers like us notice when students make mistakes because of their first language. You know, this happens. People say informations, for example, because in Italian you can say informazione, but and in English you can't say informations. But what we don't notice actually is how often students are relying on their first language and it works. Because if they say something correct, we don't notice. So I think that we're not, when we tell students, stop thinking in Italian, blah, 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 you know, it's when they make a mistake. But actually, you know, we don't say that when they've said something correctly. When they've relied on their first language, when something's actually very similar in Italian, and they've produced it in English correctly, we don't say, hey, you got that from Italian, didn't you? You know, even though it's correct, I didn't like it. You know, we don't say that, right? So I think that accepting the fact that your first language is part of using a second language, for one thing, because that's just the way your brain works. And that can actually be an asset. It can be a helpful thing. And just sort of gently helping students see where the differences sort of are, right? So like sometimes students do make mistakes based on their first language because they're sort of translating in their head. But sometimes that translation is very successful. When
that's a
it's
great
not
point.
successful, that's where we can kind of gently say, oh, but see, here there's a difference. I know, you know, sometimes it's Italian and English are very similar, but here there's a difference, and let's look at that difference, and not being like, hey, stop thinking Italian. You know, I don't think that's helpful because I don't think students can do that. I mean, can they really just turn it off? I'm not really.
Yeah, I mean, they kind of rely on it, and it's like training wheels. You know, maybe the better you get, you know, you can slowly start to take one off, then the second one off, or something. But you know, maybe it just happens over time, kind of naturally.
I think it's part of the language learning process. It's part of moving from B1 to B2 to C1. I mean, fluency itself is a big difference between B2 and C1. You know, you are getting much more fluent at C1. You're able to sort of process the language much more sort of rapidly. And I mean, that's just you getting better at speaking the language.
And as Monica says, the more you speak, the better. So, you know, and that's kind of to your point there, that as you're moving up the CEFR levels, you know, you should be thinking more and more, as it were, in the L2.
Yeah, and the more stuff you know, the more stuff you have in your head. If the word is there and it's in English and you have it, and you can just use it, and you don't have to go looking for it. You don't have to try to translate it. So the more language you have, the more successful you're going to be able to just use English without sort of relying on any help from another language.
Yeah, and you know, some of that's just experience, like with idioms and expressions.
Absolutely.
And so on.
So we've all said something embarrassing in a second language, and then
even in a first.
learn very quickly that that's not how you say it in that language.
Well, anyway, unfortunately, I think we're going to have to wrap this up. We could go on for, I'm sure, a lot longer. The only thing I can tell everyone is that we'll certainly have Ethan back in the near future. And, you know, so thank you, everyone, for the afternoon. And we'll see you the next time. We'll be doing another event in March. So keep your eyes on the email. Mondadori will be sending out the next invitations in the near future. I think they'll also be sending the attestati shortly as well. So thanks again. Thanks for all the questions. Sorry we couldn't get to them all, but you know, like I said, Ethan will be back. So don't forget. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. You've been a very. It's nice to see so many comments in the chat box. So thank you for your participation, and yeah, great. Hopefully, I'll be back soon. It sounds like.
Cool. Let's hope. Yeah. Bye. Ciao.
Bye, everybody.